Okay, let's talk about my 2025 reading year. I guess this could be considered my favorites of the year sort of video. I know this is like an iconic booktube sort of video, but I don't actually make them every year. And I put a lot of pressure in my head around the process of like narrowing down to what my actual favorites are. And then I start to go down the path of what is a favorite, what makes it a favorite. Is it because it's a great book? And like, we're just kind of going off of vibes right now. So I guess to give you an idea of why this is like a little bit challenging for me, I read 111 books or 110 books in 2025, and I truly enjoyed the reading experience for over half of those. And some of the books I may have marked at the time that I loved them, but then they like didn't settle into my head in a way that was memorable. So while the actual reading experience was really good, or like maybe, like as an example, I read We Used to Live Here, and I read Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry. At the time, in my personal tracker, I put both of these as I loved them. And I loved them for what they were. Like, I found We Used to Live Here to be like a really great haunted house psychological thriller. And it was the peak of what that genre can really be for me. And so I loved it for what it was. But when I look holistically at like how a book settles in my mind or in my brain, like that didn't last. Like I don't think about it a lot. I had a really enjoyable time reading it at the time, but it kind of just drifted off for me. And a thriller is never going to be my favorite book. I could really enjoy one, and that could be the best version of what I like, but it will never be a favorite. For Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry, it was a really great historic middle grade novel. Something that pushed the boundaries for me of like how gritty a middle grade can be and the darkness of the topics that could be explored. I thought it was really well done, and at the time I really loved it. It just didn't really settle in my brain as like an all-time favorite. I don't love middle grade generally. They're not long-lasting for me. Usually in the same way a sci-fi or a fantasy or a horror or made for adults can live in my head forever. So while I did at the time really love both of these books and they were the best version of that type of book, I personally wouldn't consider them favorites, which is why these types of videos are kind of hard for me. So we're kind of going to have like a more chatty conversation about my favorites. I want to talk about horror and kind of start there because this year I read a lot more horror than I usually do. And I think that I've found that I don't always like campy horror, but there's something about like a campy, people are dying, there's comedic relief, there's the dichotomy of the horrific and the camp and the lightheartedness really blends well for me. I think that the kind of lens through that where you could be a bit more hyperbolic with what's happening because like the campiness allows the nonsensicalness to kind of foster well. It just works for me. And so I feel like I'm starting to kind of get a better tune in on my horror preferences. And so I wanted to talk about two campier books that I enjoyed this year, or actually three. And I think these are like the three that I read of the year, but they just like all worked really well for me. I guess I Used to Be a Teenage Slasher might be considered campy, but I kind of hated that book, but that's not the topic of this video. Also, you know, in the way that I was saying that like a thriller is like never gonna be like my favorite book, like, these are never going to be my favorite book either, but like, if I want something that I don't have to take too seriously, or like I want to just have fun, like I kind of want a popcorn read, this is kind of like a niche that is currently really working for me to kind of like a palate cleanse, I guess. And so for this, one of the books I read this year was We Love the Nightlife. I've talked about this book a few times on my channel so far. This book centers around vampires in London, and there's multiple timelines. There's the current timeline of 2 vampires. One of them was the vampire, the maker of the other vampire, a timeline where that younger vampire hadn't been made yet, and it's like their kind of, shall we say, courtship of becoming a vampire many years before. And then we have an earlier timeline of like the creation of the older vampire, and they're all female, and there's just like this grittiness and with the London vibes, and like it doesn't take itself too seriously, and it's like you're kind of getting a lot of reveals in the past timelines about the modern timeline, and like the younger vampire is kind of asking herself like if everything she knows is real, like if the creation of her into a vampire, of her leaving her whole own life, her old life behind, if that decision that she made was based off of truth, and trying to uncover that in the present, and then you're getting those like drawbacks into the past, and you're discovering that with her. Again, doesn't take itself too seriously, there can't be, but I enjoyed that book a lot. Another one that falls into this category, this is a YA, I think. It's called Here Lies a Vengeful Bitch, and I think it's YA. I don't know. It's tagged as YA. The protagonist is young. It's fairly dark, though. And you're following someone who wakes up, and she wakes up in a river. And then she ends up in the river near a town that she thought was abandoned, but there are like other people living there, and she's kind of coming to grips with the fact that she's dead. And then once she kind of comes to grips with that, it's this discovery of who killed her, and it's just like a romp of like her trying to hunt these people down, her contending with her past, her being like still like alive looking, but like but she's not alive, and like her having to comes to grips with like her high school, and dealing with her mom, and like she can't find her best friend. And it was just like kind of a wild ride. It was like a lot of nonsense. There's a lot of weird shit that happened, but it was just funny. It was written pretty well, and it worked for me in the time. Okay, and then we have Play Nice by Rachel Harrison. I read this for my haunted house project, and Rachel Harrison writes a lot of kind of rompy books that are in the horror genre but aren't taking themselves too seriously. In this one, you're following an influencer that lives in New York City, and her mom just died, who her and her sisters have been estranged from, and she decides her mom's old haunted house is left for them, and the other sisters want nothing to do with it, but she decides that she's going to make content around fixing this place up, but it's haunted, so things ensue. And her mom wrote a book in the past about the haunted house, so you're getting like her reading the book for the first time, kind of splitting up the narrative, and then like slowly more and more horrific things happen. And then Rachel Harrison tends to have like romantic elements also in her horror, so it's like campy horror romance. It just, though I wouldn't call it like a true romance, there's just romantic elements to them, and it just works for me. So yeah, those are like my 3 like campy books that I read this year that like I think back on them and the reading experience quite fondly. Okay, one more horror, and then we'll get off the horror kick, and we'll go into other genres. This one is not campy. This is The Lamb by Lucy Rose. This is definitely actually my favorite horror I read this year. I could say that fairly confidently. This is rural, isolated, cannibalistic horror. So if you don't like body gore, it's not going to work for you. In this, you have a child protagonist that I think worked really well for this narrative. She lives with her mom. They're isolated. And her mom is a cannibal and will take in strays, and they will eat the strays. And so you see this, like, I think she's like 10-ish. She's not that old. 10-year-old, kind of like coming of age while she's at school, and like having to find that line of like knowing something is going on in her house that might not be okay. But still kind of like parroting the behaviors of the mother because that's what she idolizes. And then one day they take in a stray that never leaves. And it just had this like really creepy, eerie kind of sensation throughout it. And the ending of it was really intense. And I'm really glad the author just like took it there and like went all the way with the narrative. Very good. Highly recommend if you're into that sort of thing. Okay, let's break up with some nonfiction. I read a lot of nonfiction this year. I enjoyed a lot of nonfiction this year. I have a whole video where I talk about every nonfiction I read this year, which if you're more interested in my thoughts on that, because I basically like mostly everything I read, I would recommend watching that. But I would say that like, one of my favorite experiences of the year was like diving really, really deeply into the history of the Democratic Republic of Congo. I read 3 books around this topic. I read Cobalt Red, the Lumumba plot, and King Leopold's Ghost. In that order, though that's like the opposite of chronology. So I really loved this project of diving really deeply into the history of one place that I really knew nothing about. So I learned a ton in that process, but I also like didn't know I was going to read the next book until I finished one and then found out the other existed and kind of just kept digging and digging and digging. And I currently have another book in the footsteps of Mr. Kurtz ready to read as well, to keep diving into this country. For those who don't know, Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad takes place in the DRC. And so this is like the part of the world that is being explored, though in much better nonfiction detail. Though a lot of the experience of Heart of Darkness was based off of the author's experience in the Congo for a very short period of time. I'll go in the order that I like read them in. So Cobalt Red is dealing with a much more modern crisis, with cobalt mining specifically, though there's a lot of mining that occurs in the DRC. The author, this is a piece of investigative journalism where the author spends time on the ground in the DRC, going to the camps that it's mined at, interviewing the miners. He's basically trying to see if you can actually like follow cobalt through its entire supply chain. And the answer is no, but there's so much more to this book other than that answer, because he gets really deep into like the exploitative nature of the mining, like exploiting the earth and its resources, dirtying waterways, the exploitative conditions that many workers face, the dangerous working conditions, the slave type conditions in some places, and like the complete like destruction of the environment in these places, so that like people can't mine their land, people can't harvest crops from this land anymore. The water is not drinkable. These are the only places that there are jobs available, and the labor, the costs or the in the amount that they're making is not enough to pay for a basic, even remotely comfortable life. It's very eye-opening and well worth your time. And then the Lumumba plot is a narrative nonfiction historical style book that looks at the time in the DRC when they obtained freedom or obtained independence from Belgium. And it's looking at the come up of this, like the time before and like the incidents that led to the independence of the DRC, and then what happened afterwards in terms of the politics of the land, who took power, and like how that played out on a geopolitical scale. Really, really greatly paced narrative nonfiction, really fascinating. All the characters that real people, but characters within the book that were at play were really well described, really fully formed. I found it a really interesting book, and even if you don't think that you have an interest in learning about something like this, the way that it's structured is so plotty and pacey that I think even people that wouldn't originally have an interest in this topic would come out of the book enjoying it. And then the last one, King Leopold's Ghost. This is about before that time, specifically when King Leopold of Belgium purchased this land and began excavating it for its resources, physical resources like ivory and rubber, but extracting labor from the people of the country in like internal slave labor, essentially, to extract these resources. Belgium didn't own the land. He privately owned this colony. How he was able to do that, and then how eventually like the world found out about it and turned against him, and it became in the end a Belgian colony. Also very interesting read, well worth your time. Those all together, I think like just was a really great deep dive into the DRC, where each of them kind of referenced things that happened in the others, like, or that the others focused on, but there wasn't a lot of overlap in terms of like, I felt like I was like relearning information over and over again. Really great reading experience. I highly recommend. Okay, and then I think that like my personal kind of standalone favorite reading like nonfiction book of the year is No More Tears. This is like my perfect sort of nonfiction. It has an introduction that explains everything the author is going to tell you about and prove to you, and it met all of those. Like it just was really well laid out and then met all of those things. So if you read the introduction and you think, wow, that's going to be really fascinating, then you're going to like the book, because he then goes into a ton of detail proving all of these things, going into the nitty-gritty of each of the topics. It's also an investigative journalistic piece. I love when journalists have the energy and time and resources to do a massive deep dive into a topic and be able to write a book about it. They just come out so well researched, and like this is no exception. And then this is a corporate expose about Johnson & Johnson, which is a household name in the US. Johnson & Johnson owns a ton of subsidiary companies, so you're touching Johnson & Johnson products even if you don't know it. And then it is about, not only is it a corporate expose, but it is also about a pharmaceutical company, which I also love learning about. So it kind of like hit all of the niches that I really love. Another book this year that hit those niches but like wasn't as powerful for me is Bottle of Lies, which is very similar but about the generic drug industry, whereas this one is specifically just talking about Johnson & Johnson. This explored such a wide array of issues that Johnson & Johnson has masked or gone through throughout the years, and the way in which it has maintained its really like family-friendly reputation through all of this. It also, which I really like, is not just explores like the corporate expose elements of this, but is also constructing an argument for how our regulatory bodies, i.e. in this case the FDA, are lacking and like don't have proper oversight powers to be able to control things like this. So I'm being very vague with what it talks about because there's so much that this book discusses. So I'll just name off a few. Baby powder being sold for over 50 years, knowingly harming people because of the asbestos contamination that they'd had in them. Antipsychotics being prescribed off-label for disruptive children, which is not a psychological condition, and to the elderly as a dementia medication off-label as well, with no good data in either of these circumstances, and for the young kids causing irreparable or unchangeable damage to their body, and like boys growing breast tissue that like cannot, once it's there, doesn't go away. Performing shadow recalls, which is basically like there's drugs on the shelf and you as a consumer could just go and pick them up, and they have people go out to these stores where they have bad lots and and buy them so that they can go around having to notify the agency, which is illegal. Deadly birth control patches. Like, I mean, there are so many topics that this touches on. So, a perfect nonfiction for me. I love books like this. Okay, we're gonna talk about a dystopian. This is probably like on a lot of people's radars. It came out this year, The Compound. I don't know how many people have experiences like this, but like when I was a child, I would just like sometimes be like so absorbed in a book that like I would just like fall into it, and then I would just like compulsively read it. And as a child, you like don't have responsibilities, so you can just do that, and you could just like read a book from start to finish. And that sort of like compulsive, like intense interest in a book is something I experienced so much more as a child than I have as an adult. But I had this while I read this book, and I read it over the course of like less than 24 hours, like in the middle of a work week. So this takes place in like a dystopian, I would say like a near future dystopian sort of world in which the environment is crumbling, everything's really hot, there's environmental disaster after environmental disaster, but you're not focused on that, you're focused on a reality show. So you start the narrative with your protagonist just waking up in what is called the compound. And this is the reality show part of it. You have 12 women and 12 men who live in the compound. And there are a few rules. Number one, you can't talk about your life before or outside of the compound. You can't discuss those things. Number two, you have to end the night in sharing a bed with someone of the opposite gender, or you're gone the next day. And then there are challenges that occur, like group challenges and personal challenges. And when you do personal challenges that are just for you, you get rewards, and you cannot tell people what your challenges were. And there is no like cameramen or anything like that. Like, it's all very isolated. You're not seeing the crew at all. And it is a reality show, but it's not like there's no meta conversation. You're not following people outside of the reality show looking in. You're just following the crew or the cast as they kind of involve themselves in this social experiment. And the links that like people will start to go to for these challenges. Like at first, maybe a challenge sounds like something that they would never do because it would put people in harm's way, but does that change over time? And this is a book that could have done more than it did. It touched very briefly on different conversations. There's just like this aura of like consumerism and like being obsessed with that consumeristic mentality while you know that the world around you is being depleted of resources. And so like and then there's like touching, like a very light touching on the way that like the white cast is treated versus any non-white cast. And like the author could have gone deeper with those things, but I still was just like enthralled as the numbers of people kept dwindling and dwindling, and you get down to the end and rules are changing and you don't know who's gonna leave next. And I like watching reality TV, so that's part of probably what I enjoyed in this. But there's something like so eerie and dystopian and compulsive about all of it. I had such a fun time reading this book. Okay, now let's move to fantasy. Probably my most read genre. I'm not going to talk about a ton of fantasy books, though. Yeah, we'll start with the Sevenwaters series. So I kind of always have, or like I really enjoy diving really, really deep into like a long, like a universe that's like big. Like there's a lot of books. You get to kind of like explore the universe in some capacity, see it through time, see it from different perspectives, have it kind of grow around you. I really like that when it comes to fantasy novels. And which, if you've watched this channel for a while, you would know, because The Realm of the Elderling is by far my favorite fantasy series I've ever read. The one that I was kind of in the midst of throughout the course of the year was the Sevenwaters series. So this is 6 books and a short story or a novella, but it's really like 2 different trilogies. I probably will end up making like a longer form video about this series because I do think that it's really good for certain people, but a lot of people that like fantasy might not like these books. These are very like historically focused. They take place in what is clearly Ireland. The Irish lore around creatures within Irish lore are like the types of creatures that make up this fantastical realm, and this takes place in mainly in Northern Ireland, where like the Sevenwaters family lives. There's magical abilities, but it's more about like this ancient rooting to the earth and the environment and the gifts from the Fae. And so there's like people within the family that are touched by magic. And it's a fantasy romance. So like in the first trilogy, you're following different generations of a family. And so for a generation to beget a new generation, you need a romance of some capacity in it. So it kind of is, the romantic elements are imperative to the continuation of the series and the events that tie the books to the next ones. But the romance is very much deeply ingrained in the books. The first trilogy is the generational one. I would say that one's stronger. There's strong characters. There's a real like sense of darkness through them. And it's the family dealing with war and dealing with changing times and changing traditions and like Christianity coming and kind of stamping out the old ways of life, and a prophecy and like a chosen one, and You don't know who the chosen one is. It kind of slowly develops over time. It was just a really nice world to kind of sink into. And then the second trilogy, I would say it's not generational, so it takes place within months or years of the third book ending. The fifth one was bad. I didn't like it at all, but the fourth and sixth one were still interesting and kind of had a new villain that emerged within the Fae realm, and had that family still contending with the Fae, the changing of the Fae, I guess I'll say, because I don't want to say too much because it'll kind of spoil the ending of the first trilogy. Not a trilogy for a series for everyone, but I really enjoyed it. It was a buddy read this year with Mariana. I think we spent probably most of the year reading this. Yeah, enjoyable. And then this one is, the last book I'm going to talk about is really something that is like, felt very one of a kind for me in terms of my enjoyment and experience with it. It's Shubeik, Lubeik. This is a graphic novel by an Egyptian author. It was translated into English. And this is, at the root, the story is, what if the concept of wishes, like a genie in the bottle, you get 3 wishes. What if the concept of wishes was real? And not only was it real, but it was commodified, so you could buy wishes. And so then you follow a man who has 3 of like the top tier sort of wishes, and he just wants to get rid of them. And he sells them quite cheap. And you follow each of the 3 people that buy the wishes and how they contend with the use of the wishes, their relationship to the wishes, because some people don't like the commodification of wishing, and just kind of like that's those 3 storylines. And then each of the storylines are broken up by interludes where they explain the world or the timeline of the world or the colonization or like imperialization of wishes in some capacity. It was just such an interesting concept. The artwork was beautiful. It was really well crafted. I've read nothing like it, and it was just so refreshing. It had a lot of really interesting themes without being too over the top with them. It's a book that, like, I don't know, I think that, like, it might scare off a lot of readers because I'm not a graphic novel reader, but I really enjoyed this. It had, like, a really good, tight storyline that relied on the artwork, but didn't totally, I don't know how to say that correctly, but I have a hard time just reading artwork. I like words, so I was originally scared off by that, but like, well worth the time. I still thought it worked really well. Yeah, I didn't know, I guess, that a graphic novel could do so much. Like, it was just a one of a kind read for me. I really enjoyed it. So I think that I'll kind of just end it there. Like I said, I read a ton of great books this year. So narrowing it down just to talk about a few was a little bit challenging, but I think that kind of like explains like where I'm at with my reading and like the vibes of the types of books that I was picking up this year. So I guess that's all I have for this video. So until next time, happy reading.